free to produce and ship much more oil, as much as it wants. In fact, damage during the 2-week war here has limited some production.
For 40 years, Iran believed it owned a piece of geography that the world could not live without. The Strait of Hormuz, 39 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, was not simply a waterway in Iranian strategic doctrine. It was the sword Tehran kept sheathed at the throat of the global economy, the single geographic asset that made every American president, every European finance minister, every Asian energy buyer pause before pushing Iran too far. Close the strait and the world chokes. Close the strait and oil prices detonate. Close the strait and the carefully constructed architecture of global energy security collapses inside a single trading session. That was the theory. That was the doctrine. That was the conviction Iran built its entire deterrence posture around for 4 decades, and it was a conviction so total, so unquestioned, that no Iranian general, no IRGC strategist, no Supreme National Security Council planner ever seriously asked the question that should have been asked from the beginning. What if we close it, and the world does not crawl to us for permission to survive? What if we close it, and the world quietly, methodically, ruthlessly engineers its way around us instead? In February 2026, Iran finally found out. The IRGC closed the strait in retaliation for the joint American and Israeli strikes that began on February 28th, and the immediate impact was everything Iranian doctrine had promised. Maritime traffic through Hormuz collapsed by more than 90% within 72 hours. Somewhere between 17 and 20 million barrels of oil per day disappeared from global markets in what the Defense Horizon Journal described as potentially the largest single energy disruption in modern history. Brent crude surged past $100 per barrel. War risk insurance for tankers transiting the Gulf became, for a period of days, effectively unavailable at any price. Shipping firms suspended operations.
The new supreme leader of Iran, Mojtaba Khamenei, has vowed to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed in a statement read out on state television, his first communication since taking over from his father. After 3 more cargo ships were attacked in the Gulf today, oil prices again rose above $100 a barrel. The International Energy Agency.
The opening minutes of the closure looked exactly like the catastrophe Tehran had spent decades promising it could deliver. And then something happened that no one in Tehran's strategic apparatus appears to have modeled. The world did not panic into submission. The world reached for a different map. And on that map, the United Arab Emirates was already holding the answer in its hands, an answer it had spent more than a decade quietly building, and one that Iran had told itself would never matter because the strait was supposed to be impossible to circumvent. The UAE did not fire a missile in response. It did not deploy troops. It opened a pipeline. And in the moment that pipeline began pumping at maximum capacity through the desert toward Fujairah, Iran's most powerful weapon began the slow, irreversible process of turning into the instrument of its own strategic decapitation. The numbers that made the world hold its breath. To understand why Iran's gamble failed so completely, the numbers have to come first, because everything else in this story flows from them. Before February 28, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz carried approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day, a figure that represented roughly 20% of all global petroleum liquids consumption. 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas also transited that same narrow corridor every single day. In 2025, nearly 15 million barrels per day of crude oil and condensate, representing 34% of all global crude oil trade, moved through Hormuz. 84% of that flow went to Asian markets. China and India combined received 44% of all Hormuz crude oil shipments. Japan and South Korea were not just dependent on this corridor, they were structurally addicted to it, with no realistic short-term substitute for the molecules that move through it every 24 hours. The International Energy Agency had no formal language, no contingency vocabulary, no published doctrine for what happens when all of this stops moving simultaneously, because no serious analyst had been willing to model a world in which Iran would actually pull the trigger it had spent so long threatening to pull. The threat of closure was always understood to be more powerful than the closure itself, and that asymmetry was supposed to be the permanent foundation of Iranian leverage. Then the foundation cracked. When the strikes hit on February 28th, the IRGC executed the closure with operational efficiency that surprised even its critics. Mines were laid in the navigational channels. Anti-ship missile batteries on Keshm and Hormuz Islands locked active radars onto every transiting hull. Fast attack craft swarmed approaches. Within 48 hours, the world's most important energy artery was, for all practical commercial purposes, shut. And in those 48 hours, every assumption that had governed global energy security since the 1980s was placed under a kind of stress test that doctrine had never anticipated. Oil traders stopped trading and started watching. Asian refiners began calculating how many days of strategic reserves they had before fuel rationing would become politically necessary. European insurance underwriters convened emergency sessions. American carrier strike groups repositioned. And in the middle of all of this, in the calm rooms of Abu Dhabi, where MBZ's strategic planners had been preparing for exactly this scenario for years, a different calculation was already being executed, one that did not depend on Iranian permission and did not require Iranian cooperation. The UAE was about to demonstrate, in real time and at industrial scale, that the trump card Iran had spent 40 years sharpening was not actually as sharp as Tehran had convinced itself it was. The pipeline that quietly rewrote the map. The Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, known in industry shorthand as ADCOP and to engineers as the Habshan-Fujairah line, runs 380 kilometers from the Habshan oil and gas fields in southwestern Abu Dhabi across the desert interior of the UAE to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. The geography matters here in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. Fujairah does not sit inside the Persian Gulf. Fujairah sits on the other side of the Emirati landmass entirely, on the open ocean, outside the Strait of Hormuz, already connected to the deep-water shipping routes that carry oil to Asia, Europe, and the rest of the world without ever needing to pass within range of an Iranian missile battery. The pipeline has a designed capacity of approximately 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels per day, and the moment Iran closed the strait, ADNOC, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, did exactly what it had built the pipeline to do. It pushed throughput toward maximum. According to Kepler's senior oil analyst Naveen Das, the line had been running at roughly 71% utilization in the days before the crisis, leaving approximately 440,000 barrels per day of immediately available spare capacity, and ADNOC moved aggressively to lift volumes toward the upper engineering tolerance of 1.8 million barrels per day within the first week of the closure. Think about what that means in human terms, not just in barrels. Every barrel that exited at Fujairah was a barrel that did not need Iranian permission. Every tanker that loaded on the Gulf of Oman was a vessel that did not need to thread the gauntlet of Iranian mines and missiles. Every shipment that reached an Asian refinery via the bypass was a quiet, unspoken refutation of the entire premise of Iranian leverage. And the UAE did not stop at simply pumping oil. It moved, with a speed that surprised even Western diplomats, to publicly redefine its relationship with Tehran in language that left no ambiguity about which side of the conflict Abu Dhabi now considered itself to be on. UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, known globally as MBZ, used the word enemy, not rival, not neighbor with competing interests, not regional competitor, enemy. The UAE closed its embassy in Tehran and withdrew all diplomatic staff within 24 hours of the war's opening salvos. It shut Iranian schools, cultural centers, and official representations operating inside Emirati territory. And then, in a step that would have been almost unthinkable even 12 months earlier, the UAE publicly signaled its willingness to support American military operations to forcefully reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The Wall Street Journal reported that Emirati officials had urged the United States, alongside European and Asian military powers, to assemble a coalition that would break Iran's grip on the waterway by force. One Emirati official went further, suggesting that the coalition consider occupying the Iranian-held islands inside the strait, including Abu Musa, an island that Abu Dhabi has long claimed and that Iran has held since 1971. This is not the language of a country threading a diplomatic needle. This is the language of a country that has been bombed, that has watched Iranian missiles strike its airports and refineries and financial centers, and that has decided, at the level of its highest leadership, that the era of strategic ambiguity with Tehran is permanently finished. The missiles that hardened Emirati resolve. The scale of Iranian attacks on the UAE explains, in a way that no diplomatic communiqué ever could, why the Emirati position hardened so fast and so completely. According to figures released by the UAE Ministry of Defense, Iranian forces tracked 174 ballistic missiles toward Emirati territory during the first weeks of the war. Of those, 161 were intercepted by a layered air defense network that combined Patriot, THAAD, and indigenous Emirati systems. 13 fell into the sea. 689 drones were detected, of which 645 were intercepted. 8 cruise missiles penetrated the defensive layers and struck Emirati territory directly. Iranian drones hit the
on the ground, and reporting says it's going to take years to repair. What does this mean long-term for the viability of LNG from that country or even the region?
Yeah, Ras Laffan is the biggest LNG export project in the world, and Qatar is the second largest exporter in the world, and so this will...
Port of Fujairah itself, the very terminus of the pipeline the UAE was using to bypass the strait, triggering fires and forcing the temporary suspension of oil loading operations. Iranian drones struck Dubai International Airport, igniting a fire on the airfield and forcing a temporary closure of one of the busiest aviation hubs in the world. An Iranian strike hit an ADNOC refinery facility that would otherwise produce 922,000 barrels per day, forcing a shutdown that rippled through downstream fuel supplies. A tower in Dubai Creek Harbor was struck. The Dubai International Financial Center Innovation Hub was damaged. A Palestinian national was killed when a missile hit a civilian car in Abu Dhabi. 2 Emirati service members died in a helicopter crash during defensive operations. These are not abstract figures on a strategic dashboard. These are funerals in Abu Dhabi. These are families in Dubai who watch smoke rise over a skyline that had spent 2 decades being marketed to the world as the safest, most modern, most untouchable urban environment in the Middle East. These are construction workers, taxi drivers, school teachers, who suddenly discovered that the security premium baked into every property valuation, every business contract, every long-term investment thesis in the UAE had been built on an assumption about Iranian restraint that Tehran itself had now demolished. The psychological dimension here is the part that most pure energy analysis misses, and it is the part that will reverberate the longest. The UAE was not just attacked. It was attacked in a way that made every Emirati citizen, every expatriate professional, every Gulf businessman understand viscerally that the old buffer was gone, and that no amount of diplomatic ambiguity could restore it. When MBZ used the word enemy, he was not improvising. He was ratifying a conclusion that the entire Emirati public had already reached on its own, in real time, while watching air defense interceptors light up the night sky over their cities. And the cruelest irony, the one that will be studied in war colleges for decades, is that the very Iranian strikes intended to punish the UAE for supporting American operations had the precise opposite effect. Each missile that hit a UAE facility converted one more diplomatic stakeholder into an active opponent. Each drone that struck Fujairah oil infrastructure made the Emirati leadership more determined, not less, to ensure that Iran's strategic chokehold over the strait was permanently dismantled, rather than merely suspended. Iranian planners appear to have believed that bombing the UAE would force Abu Dhabi to pressure Washington into a ceasefire, that the pain of attack would translate into political pressure for de-escalation. Instead, the pain of attack translated into a permanent strategic realignment. The UAE did not flinch, it hardened, and in hardening, it took every other Gulf Cooperation Council state with it. Saudi Arabia, the Petroline, and the coalition that coalesced around the bypass. Saudi Arabia's response amplified the Emirati pivot into something that began to look like a genuine, if partial, redirection of Gulf energy flows. The East-West crude oil pipeline, known in the industry as the Petroline, runs 1,200 kilometers from the ADCOP processing center near the Persian Gulf coast to the Yanbu export hub on the Red Sea. Before the crisis, Saudi Arabia was using approximately 2 million barrels per day of the Petroline's capacity. By March 2026, Riyadh had pushed throughput to roughly 7 million barrels per day, the upper rated capacity of the system after a previously announced upgrade that had been completed quietly over the preceding years. Saudi Arabia hit that ceiling and held it. Combined with the UAE's ADCOP throughput, the available bypass capacity around the strait reached something in the range of 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day, depending on which conservative or optimistic engineering assumption one accepts. That is a meaningful figure. It is also, and this is the part Tehran has so far refused to acknowledge in its public statements, far below the 20 million barrels per day that normally transit Hormuz. The bypasses, in other words, did not replace Hormuz. They softened the catastrophe. They prevented a complete global energy collapse. They demonstrated, with industrial proof rather than rhetorical promise, that the world could function at painful cost without Iranian permission. But the political effect of the bypasses ran far ahead of their physical capacity. Each barrel that exited through Fujairah or Yanbu was a barrel that quietly told every Asian importer, every European refiner, every American policymaker that Iran's geographic monopoly was breakable. And once a strategic assumption is broken, it cannot be unbroken. The energy security analyst Kepler quoted in early reporting, and the team at the Defense Horizon Journal that produced some of the most rigorous open-source analysis of the bypass dynamics, both reached the same fundamental conclusion. The deterrence architecture Iran had built around the strait depended on the universal belief that closure was unthinkable. Iran chose to think the unthinkable. And the moment it did, every Gulf producer, every Asian energy importer, every multinational oil major began the long, expensive, patient work of reducing their dependence on Iranian geography forever. Iran's response to the bypass pivot was exactly what one would expect from a strategy that had run out of cards. It attacked the bypass infrastructure directly. Iranian drones struck Fujairah port. Iranian-aligned militia drone strikes targeted pumping stations along the Saudi East-West Pipeline in April, cutting throughput by approximately 700,000 barrels per day for a period before repairs restored flow. The energy analyst quoted by Al Jazeera described pipelines and pumping stations as static, high-value targets, easier to hit than moving ships, impossible to hide, expensive to repair. Iran was correct about the vulnerability. What Iran was wrong about was the political consequence of exploiting it. Each strike on bypass infrastructure did not restore Iranian leverage. It accelerated the coalescence of the Gulf states, the United States, Europe, and Asia around a shared objective that had been merely theoretical 6 months earlier and was now operational doctrine. The objective was the permanent end of Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz by whatever combination of pipelines, naval coalitions, and infrastructure investments would be required to achieve it. The limits that Iran tried and failed to exploit. It is important, in the interest of analytical honesty, to acknowledge what the bypasses cannot do, because Iran's remaining strategic argument depends entirely on these limitations. The total combined sustainable bypass capacity, around 5 million barrels per day at the absolute upper engineering bound, is less than half of what Hormuz normally carries. That gap, 10 to 15 million barrels per day depending on the baseline used, simply cannot be closed by existing pipeline infrastructure. It can only be closed by demand destruction, by the release of strategic petroleum reserves, by production shut-ins at the wellhead, and by the long-term construction of additional bypass routes that will take 3 to 5 years to complete even under the most favorable political conditions. The crude that the ADCOP pipeline carries is Emirati Murban grade, exclusively. Iraqi crude, Kuwaiti crude, Qatari condensate, Bahraini production, none of it has access to the UAE bypass. None of it has a meaningful land-based escape route. The Petroline carries Saudi crude only. The barrels of Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain remain trapped, in the structural sense, behind the strait. Liquefied natural gas is the dimension where Iranian leverage retains its sharpest edge, at least for now. Qatar produces roughly 77 million tons per year of LNG, and there is no viable land-based bypass for liquefied gas. LNG is, by physics and by infrastructure, tanker-dependent. It cannot be pumped through a pipeline at cryogenic temperatures across hundreds of kilometers of desert. The same is true, to a lesser extent, of refined products such as diesel, gasoline, and jet fuel, which depend largely on the same tanker routes that transit Hormuz. The UAE can move its crude through Fujairah, but the refined products from its downstream facilities still depend, to a significant degree, on the maritime corridor Iran has closed. This is the dimension on which Iranian strategists are now placing their remaining strategic bets, that the gas shock and the products shock will compound into a market panic large enough to force a Western negotiating concession before the bypasses can be expanded. The bypass terminals themselves are also vulnerable, and Iran has demonstrated that it understands this. Fujairah is a single coastal hub. If Iranian missiles or sabotage operations succeed in damaging its tank farms, its loading jetties, or its pumping infrastructure in a sustained way, the UAE bypass becomes an instant bottleneck rather than a relief valve. The Saudi East-West Pipeline depends on a small number of pumping stations, each of which is a discrete, fixed, locatable target. Yanbu's export terminal is already operating near its loading limit, and the bottleneck in the Saudi system has migrated, under wartime conditions, from the line itself to the port. Pump capacity, power supply, tank storage, berth availability, and traffic management all impose real-world ceilings that sit well below the nameplate engineering capacities quoted in industry brochures. Wartime surge operations introduce risks of congestion, mechanical failure, and operational accident that compound the formal capacity limits. And even when oil successfully exits the Gulf through the Red Sea or the Indian Ocean, it is not yet free of risk. Tankers loading at Yanbu must transit the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a corridor that Houthi forces have already turned into a high-risk zone with sustained drone and missile attacks against commercial shipping. Tankers seeking to avoid the Suez and the Bab el-Mandeb entirely must reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks of voyage time, hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional freight costs per voyage, and dramatically higher insurance premiums. The net effect is that bypassing Hormuz does not eliminate maritime risk. It displaces it, redistributes it across other choke points, and inflates global freight costs in ways that propagate into every consumer economy. This is the argument Iran is currently making, in the back channels through which it still communicates with mediators. The bypasses are partial. The bypasses are vulnerable. The bypasses do not solve the LNG problem. The bypasses cannot be expanded fast enough to matter within the timeline of the current war. And so, Iranian strategists are now telling themselves, the leverage is still there, just delayed. The market psychology will still break. The price shock will still come. The Asian buyers will still revolt. The argument is not unreasonable on its technical merits, but it ignores the political reality that the Emirati pivot has already created. Iran is no longer arguing against a static global system that wants to preserve the status quo. It is arguing against an actively mobilized coalition that has decided, at the level of its highest political leadership, that the discomfort of the transition is acceptable because the alternative, permanent Iranian strategic control over 20% of global energy, is no longer tolerable. The psychological architecture of a lost deterrent. This is the dimension that intelligence assessments often understate because it does not appear on any spreadsheet. The deterrent value of the Strait of Hormuz, for Iran, was never really about the oil. It was about the fear. It was about the knowledge, in every Western capital and every Asian energy ministry, that Tehran could, at a moment of its choosing, impose a level of pain on the global economy that no other regional power could approach. That fear was the actual weapon. The closure was just the trigger that the weapon had been built around, and once the trigger was pulled, the weapon either had to deliver the promised devastation, or it had to be revealed as something less than its reputation. What Iran discovered, in the 72 hours after February 28th, is that the weapon's reputation was larger than the weapon itself. The psychological dimension cuts in multiple directions simultaneously. Inside Iran, the closure was sold to the domestic population as a demonstration of strategic strength, the moment when 40 years of patient deterrence building paid off in a single decisive action. But as the days passed and the world adjusted and the bypasses pumped and the Asian buyers found alternative cargoes at marked up but still available prices, the narrative of strength became harder to sustain even for Iranian state media. Iran was seen, increasingly, not as the master of the strait, but as a country that had played its highest card and discovered the table was no longer impressed. Across the Gulf, in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Doha and Manama, the psychological pivot was the inverse. The fear that had governed Gulf foreign policy toward Iran for 40 years, the fear of being caught in a regional war, the fear of being treated as a forward operating base for American power, the fear of Iranian retaliation against soft civilian targets, was suddenly being replaced by something colder and more durable. It was being replaced by the recognition that the worst-case scenario had already arrived, that Iranian missiles had already struck Emirati cities and Saudi pumping stations and Qatari and Kuwaiti facilities, and that the only remaining strategic question was not how to avoid Iranian retaliation, but how to ensure that Iran would never again be in a position to deliver it. Infrastructure, in the Gulf imagination, is not just industrial plant, it is national identity. The skyline of Dubai, the refineries of Abu Dhabi, the financial center of Doha, the ports of Jeddah and Yanbu and Fujairah are not merely economic assets. They are the physical manifestation of the post-oil future these countries have spent decades constructing in the global imagination. When Iranian drones hit Dubai International Airport, when Iranian missiles damaged the DIFC Innovation Hub, when fires burned at Fujairah Port, the attacks were not just operational strikes against logistics targets. They were attacks on the self-image of Gulf modernity itself. And that self-image, once attacked, could not be defended through diplomatic ambiguity. It could only be defended through the permanent removal of the threat. This is the emotional logic, the human logic, that sits underneath the strategic decisions being made in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh right now. It is not a logic that yields easily to Iranian back-channel arguments about the limits of bypass capacity. The self-inflicted wound and the coalition that will not unform. There is a final dimension to Iran's miscalculation that deserves its own attention, because it is the one that will be hardest for Tehran to reverse. Iran needs the strait too. Iran's own oil exports, what remains of them after decades of Western sanctions, have historically transited Hormuz alongside the cargoes of its neighbors. Tehran inaugurated its own bypass pipeline, the Gue-Jask line, in July 2021, designed specifically to provide an alternative export route along the Gulf of Oman coast. But the Jask bypass has never operated at meaningful scale. Its effective throughput remained around 300,000 barrels per day, even at peak utilization, and loading operations effectively halted after September 2024, before the current crisis began. Iran, in other words, closed a waterway that it itself depends on, in pursuit of leverage over countries that have alternatives Iran does not. The strategic geometry of that miscalculation is staggering when laid out in full. Tehran punished its customers, alienated its neighbors, attacked the infrastructure of its own potential mediators, and in the process accelerated the construction of the very bypass architecture that would render its central deterrent obsolete. The Atlantic Council's analysis of the war's first weeks captured the dynamic with unusual precision. Iran directed 83% of its total missile and drone strikes during the war at GCC countries, with the UAE absorbing more attacks than any other state, including Israel itself. Iran did not confine its retaliation to the United States and Israel, the actors who had actually launched the original strikes. It bombed Kuwait's airport, it hit Qatar, it struck Bahrain, it hammered the UAE with nearly 1,000 projectiles. And in doing so, it converted every Gulf state from a potential diplomatic bridge, the role they had sometimes played in past crises, into a party with direct, personal, visceral reasons to want Iranian military power permanently degraded. If Tehran had hoped the Gulf states would pressure Washington toward a negotiated de-escalation, it chose the worst possible method of making that argument. The longtime regional investor quoted by the Atlantic Council put it plainly: a higher risk premium in the eyes of investors and companies is now the new reality, and it cannot be eliminated by any outcome of the war that he could envision. That premium will exist regardless of how the war ends, regardless of what concessions are made or refused, regardless of which side claims tactical victory. The structural change is permanent. What comes next is harder to forecast with confidence, and analysts honest about their uncertainty have been careful to say so. The proposed cross-peninsula corridor concept, a 116-kilometer infrastructure link connecting Sharjah's Port Khalid on the Persian Gulf side to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, has gone from a long-dormant feasibility study to a project with active political momentum behind it. If realized at the upper bounds of its proposed capacity, 2 to 4 million barrels per day, it would not replace Hormuz, but it would reduce the catastrophic leverage of closing it, transforming the strait from a binary on-off switch for global energy into one important route among several. Saudi Arabia is reported to be reviewing options for additional Red Sea export capacity. Iraq is revisiting long-stalled pipeline projects through Turkey. Each of these initiatives, individually, is a partial solution. Collectively, they represent the slow-motion engineering out of the entire Iranian leverage equation that has governed Gulf strategic dynamics since the 1979 revolution. Iran's plan was to weaponize geography. The Emirati plan, backed by Saudi Arabia, supported by the United States Navy, quietly endorsed by every Asian capital that depends on Gulf energy, is to make that geography progressively irrelevant. Not tomorrow, not in 6 months, but over the course of the infrastructure investments and diplomatic realignments that the 2026 crisis has irreversibly accelerated. The choke point that gave Iran its leverage is being engineered out of the global energy map. Every pipeline pumped to maximum capacity, every new bypass route surveyed, every long-dormant infrastructure project suddenly flush with emergency funding. Every Gulf state that has redefined Iran from neighbor to adversary in the language of its highest leadership. All of it is the slow, methodical, irreversible dismantling of the weapon Iran believed it could hold over the world forever. The Strait of Hormuz, as a binary lever Iran could pull at will, is gone. The waterway itself remains, the geography is unchanged, the maps still show the same 39 kilometers of water between Iranian and Omani coastlines. But the strategic meaning of those 39 kilometers has been permanently altered. Iran closed the strait to prove that it was indispensable. What it actually proved is that the world is motivated, capable, and now actively working to make it dispensable. The UAE opened its pipeline, Saudi Arabia maxed its petroline. Asian nations scrambled to find alternative routes and sign new supply agreements that will outlast the current war by decades. The international coalition coalesced around the goal of permanently opening the waterway, and Iran, which bombed its own neighbors, destroyed its own regional relationships, and sacrificed 40 years of carefully cultivated deterrence architecture in a single military gamble, is left watching the world engineer its way around the weapon it never expected anyone to actually try to circumvent. The Strait of Hormuz route is not just gone for now. It is being systematically and permanently bypassed. And the country that built its entire strategic identity around controlling it has been beheaded, not by a missile, but by a pipeline, and by the collective decision of the world it tried to hold hostage to find another way through.